This is David Marler, UFO researcher, and you're listening to That UFO Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to That UFO Podcast. My name is Andy, and joining me for a bonus episode after last month's popular interview on his secret Space UFOs Apollo 1 to 11 documentary, I said I would get him back on to discuss his new Fastwalkers documentary, and it's now been out for a couple of weeks. I've already heard from some of you listeners who have checked it out and you've really enjoyed it. So with no further ado, welcome back to the podcast, Darcy Weir. Hi Darcy, you okay?
I'm great. How you doing, Andy?
I'm very well. Listen, let's get into this. It seems like it came out quickly, but we discussed it, your previous documentary, right before the new one was due to come out. So, like I say, wanted to get you straight back on. We did speak last month and we've covered your background in more detail then, but just for anyone joining in this time, what is your background quickly, Darcy? And also, why do you make documentaries about the UFO phenomenon?
My background, I actually was studying film and video production as a younger lad. And I ended up pursuing a career in IT for a little while, and then was moonlighting as a filmmaker on the side. And I've always been interested in fringe theories and in ideas that we're not alone, And when I started documenting stories like this, I started with some pretty zany ideas, some pretty woo and fringe thinking stuff. But I've made my way back to a very sort of centrist way of looking, this very objective way of looking at the UFO phenomenon. And that's how I started looking into NASA and all these anomalies that have happened throughout space history to do with UFOs and, strange things happening in space. And this recent documentary, which kind of comes off the back of the Apollo era stuff that we were covering in the last conversation we had, it's called Secret Space UFOs Fastwalkers, because I really wanted to show that there's a history of space-based UFO encounters that have happened in which the Air Force documented these anomalies as fastwalkers, as UFOs or unidentified objects that are looking like they move around with intelligent control, ping-ponging in outer space around our planet, sometimes entering the Earth's atmosphere and then leaving. And we start from 1973 after the Apollo manned missions had finished in 1972, and we start to cover the space Skylab incident, Skylab 3, the first manned space station in which we have astronauts like Al Bean that witness a massive red glowing object that was 2 to 3 miles from the space station following them over Africa. And, it was a 9-minute encounter. And we cover the fact that the Air Force and these deep space satellite systems like the DSP have been tracking fastwalkers and space-based UFOs from the 1970s until now. And NASA has been privy to a lot of this information. They've had astronauts comment on the things that they saw above Earth orbit. And they sometimes say, we have an alien spacecraft under observance, or we have a UFO, we have an unidentified flying object. And then we have videos and strange recordings that come from STS space missions and the ISS missions all throughout history, leading up until now, where, look, we're at the precipice of this May 31st, 2023 live report that NASA is going to give on UAP in our day, in our time.
You have just summarised about half my questions in that very succinct that piece. So we'll dig into those in a bit more detail. And to go back to the beginning, the term Fastwalker for many is a newer term, maybe from 2017 onwards. New York Times articles and such. But like you say, it goes back decades. It's documented as going back decades, 50 years. And I think that's a great argument when people look at the modern UFO phenomenon. It's so easy to dismiss everything as drones. Everything's drones or secret military tech. And I don't doubt a lot of it probably will be, but it's a great argument to say that, we never had these kind of drones 50 years ago. You couldn't walk into your local kind of hardware store and pick up a drone for $50 or £100, whatever it might be, for a cheap drone. These things were going at incredible speeds, doing incredible things long before even our best technology could get anywhere near that, weren't they?
Yeah. I mean, if you're thinking about Fastwalker cases where an object, definitely not a drone, or at least an Earth-based drone, I mean, there's an argument that some of the UFOs we see out there might be technology that's observing us from a civilization or intelligence far, far from here. And that's the way that they're carrying out the beginning of their missions.
Yep.
I think when you look at the cases that I put down at the starting of the documentary, the DSP, Defense Satellite Program, in which was launched in 1970s and finished in 1991. These were old satellite systems by today's standards that have optical baffles on them, so cameras. They have infrared sensors and all radio and radar detectors, and they traced objects that came from deep space. For example, in 1984, one came and parked within a couple miles of the DSP system and stayed within Earth orbit and then left. And researchers like Ron Regehr were responsible for this information being pulled out of the company that manufactured the DSP system. It's called Aerojet in California. And over those 3 decades in which they recorded all of these deep space objects coming to Earth, there are hundreds of Fastwalker incidents that were recorded by the DSP system. And these are only being recorded as Fastwalkers because they're the most relevant, they're the most logical to be something that's real. And if you think about that and the history in which those happened, this is earth-shattering, groundbreaking territory. But no one's really privy to this information. And it also lends one to think that the Defense Satellite Program was an operation of the DoD, the Department of Defense in the United States. What else do they have? And Christopher Mellon recently coming out after the Aero congressional meeting saying that there is satellite imagery out there that is so high resolution, pictures and videos of these objects interacting with Earth. He wouldn't say that unless we had tons of this information. And I think they do.
I think it was alluded to and rumoured a few different times. I had some members of the Nimitz Princeton incident on a roundtable, Kevin Day, PJ Hughes and Gary Voorhees, a couple of years ago now. And they were talking about if those objects, those Tic Tacs that were coming, raining in, and they were on radar, and the radar's ceiling was 80,000 feet, and they were coming in from orbit, then it would make sense that any systems that were based along the coast to track missiles coming in from, outside the atmosphere, outside orbit, whatever the language would be, would also have caught those on their systems and sensors too. So it's likely there was some very good data captured even for those types of incidents by all types of sensors that weren't just out on those ships. And like you say, even in orbit as well. And that's the modern stuff. And you can imagine how good that will be if we've got satellites going back, like you're saying, to the 70s that have been manufactured probably in the 60s that managed to capture good data on UFOs in orbit, in space. And I think there's a lot of junk floating about in space for sure. There's a lot of misidentifications. We hear about ice crystals being reported. All of that stuff is up there. But there is very clear footage, or as clear as it can be, of objects moving at pace, slowing down, speeding up, changing direction, and keeping pace or keeping track with other objects in space as well, isn't there? There's a lot of that.
Tons. In the film, we pick up after the Tehran incident, which we try to document really well, which was another Fastwalker tracking. The Tehran UFO, which ended up being two UFOs kind of terrorizing this Iranian city, the capital city of the country. Hundreds, thousands of people witnessing this mass witness event. And the Air Force the American Air Force reportedly going over and actually debriefing and finding out what really happened and saying to the Iranians, this is not ours. This does not look like any technology that we know of on the planet. Really interesting. And then we go off the back of that to the STS missions and how that started up in the 1980s and went through to the thousands, and all of the scientific implications of those missions, because they were fantastic scientific innovations for mankind and testing out things in space for NASA. But there were all these anomalies and objects that were recorded and reported on by the astronauts. We talked about these voice recordings that we got from certain astronauts saying things on these mission days during the STS missions. And, we start back at STS 29, where John Blaha is reportedly recorded saying, we have an alien spacecraft under observance.
Yeah.
What the heck? But, Dr. Jack Kasher, who covered that with Don Ratch, the investigator who recorded that, because the thing is, a lot of people are space enthusiasts. There's many people that still watch the NASA live stream downlink footage and look for anomalies and stuff, and look at all their missions and stuff they're carrying out, and look at the fervor and interest in the public of SpaceX. People just love space. We're ready to go. If it becomes affordable and we can travel to space, people will be doing it. That is an incredible new foreign territory for us all to get off planet. And not everybody gets to do it. And the people that have been privy to have witnessed really strange things when they have. And we document in this documentary so many of these incidents where astronauts talk about and see and examine things. And so we go from STS 29 to STS 51, where we see this orb, this metallic looking sphere that just kind of floats into view. And it looks like it's analyzing what the astronaut is doing on this spacewalk, retrieving a satellite, the Telstar satellite, which two of them were launched on that mission. And what we really find in these missions, these STS videos, which are recorded on space cameras that, are extremely high tech, extremely robust camera systems that have to withstand the extreme environment of space, right? So extremely cold temperatures, radiation exposure, unfiltered light coming directly from the sun because there's no atmosphere to filter that stuff, which we're privy to. And they're shooting in a light spectrum often that cannot be seen by the human eye. And I kind of relate to that in the film to the Tic Tac or the Nimitz Go Fast gimbal UFO videos, which, you were talking about Kevin Day. They were saying that these objects came from above 80,000, feet. Mm-hmm. So what's above that? Space, right? So maybe some of these objects are Fastwalkers. They did originate from space environments. And that means that we have space agencies and satellites recording this stuff. And with the STS missions, they record in far ultraviolet light spectrum cameras. which civilians usually don't even have that technology, but NASA does. And they're all over the craft. They're laden within the NASA payload bays on the multiple crafts that they have: Atlantis, Discovery, Endeavour, Columbia. Obviously, two of those blew up. Challenger was one of them that exploded.
Mm.
Columbia was another, which is, led to loss of life, and it's sad. But these vehicles were high tech. They had amazing camera systems, and they recorded all kinds of anomalies. And in this documentary, we're breaking down, the footage, what happened throughout many decades of building the space station. Because really, the STS missions, their main goal was to launch satellites, both military and government satellites, as well as outfitting and delivering new modules to build the ISS, the International Space Station, with. Those massive payload bays would open up, and they could take huge objects out of that.
You mentioned, just before we get any further, you mentioned a few different, obviously, incidents before. Skylab, what interested me with that one, not just the incident, but the language that was used by the astronauts, I've got the quote, was it was a satellite. There were satellites like you would see on Earth, and there's also satellites like you wouldn't see on Earth, kind of dancing around the terminology. And you hear that at times, don't you? Almost like they're not sure what to say, especially in some of those earlier missions where, obviously, you mentioned John Blaha, who uses alien spacecraft as terminology, but that Skylab one where it's like, there's a satellite like you would see on Earth, but there's a satellite like you wouldn't see on Earth, and that's it. That kind of dancing around, it's really interesting to me.
Well, what we try to document too in this film is that obviously there needs to be some kind of coordination from NASA and their astronauts to be very cryptic and speak in a coded way when dealing with public information regarding UFOs. So you gave that example from 1973, but we see all throughout the STS missions, they say things like, "We have a fire," right?
Mm.
And then researchers or people that are listening to this are like, "There's a fire? What?" If there was a fire on the space station, that would be very distressing. And you would hear all kinds of conversation back and forth between ground control and the astronauts right after. But then there's a big dead space. And later on, you hear, "We have a UFO, we have a unidentified or whatever." But often a code word they'll say is like ice crystals, right? Because that gives them an easy out to debunk what was caught on camera as ice crystals, literally. And somebody who haunts me and follows me around, he's probably in the comments from the last podcast that you released, in which we had our interview about Apollo 1 to 11. You'll find Jim Oberg haunting the comments, who's a former NASA employee, and he came up with the thesis that what we're seeing in these videos is just ice, space junk, or other debris. But it can't be in all the cases, especially when we look at these videos that he says that is. You literally see objects descending down towards the Earth, then going up above the Earth's horizon, moving into formations like a circle. Like space ice doesn't do that. There's no way. And Dr. Jack Kasher, a physicist and former NASA employee as well, has been very argumentative with Jim Oberg over his blanket statement that this is all just prosaic stuff. So what NASA does to cover it up often with the astronauts. So if you look at one of the later missions that we break down, STS-115, there's two different astronauts that report this UFO that seems to be flying in formation that's definitely not metallic, possibly fabric, in formation going above the shuttle, right? A male voice says that and a female voice. And they read it really slowly as if it is some kind of script that they are trying to relay information to Capcom or to Houston without giving away to the public on that channel that there is a metallic object
Yeah.
flying in formation over the shuttle and they don't know what it is,
Yeah.
So I think it's this cryptic code word methodology that they've been employing to cover up what they're seeing. And Fastwalkers is a code word, UAP is a code word. Code words are always going to be in play when it comes to research and intelligence agencies that are inextricably linked, like NASA and the intelligence and defense agencies are linked. They always have been. They're going to use code words. And I think we were talking about these space cameras before. One thing I can say about the space cameras is that whenever we see this footage, it's very often we see the same behavior of NASA recording these anomalies and sometimes quickly cutting the feed, changing the camera direction to stop observing that object, which, any logical person would think, why are they not like zooming in on it? In some mission footage, we have seen them zoom in on the UFOs, so they might have made a boo-boo and not followed the standard procedures. But they also changed to other cameras that don't have anything being recorded on them. And what Jeff Challenger, an early NASA space footage researcher, had done, a UFO researcher, he had realized that NASA had been putting a video filter, basically adding distortion over top of their clean space video feed whenever they were recording stuff in space.
Yeah.
And that's another tactic too, because then you can say, it was just part of a video artifact or distortion, if people want to argue, hey, what was that on the footage?
Do you know what? The ice crystal stuff, I get sometimes it no doubt will be. Space junk, absolutely. There's loads of stuff in the atmosphere. We see those images now even of satellites and where they are positioned around the Earth, and it's a junkyard up there now as well. The Tehran incident, for example, 1974, like you say, loads of
1976, I believe.
We'll split the difference. But if the pilots tried to shoot down essentially a UFO, they lost their comms, systems were garbled, a smaller UFO came out of a larger object, nothing happened when they tried to shoot it down, they couldn't even eject from their plane. That clearly wasn't a big ice crystal with a smaller ice crystal coming out of it. You mentioned the DSP satellite even picked it up in infrared. So there was data backing it up as well. There was a solid object and it was chased, it was witnessed. I get though, there must be times, and I've seen loads of those incidents where the NASA footage is filming a portion of the ISS or some kind of portion of space, and the camera points down and points away and zooms back and moves out of, because something's came into range. There are times though, and I'm sure you'll agree, maybe the US has a spy satellite or China has a spy satellite and that comes into view. But that's not always the case. And it's those interesting cases, like you say, where something shoots off, or like you say, you've got the footage where the circular objects form a circle and then another one comes into the middle and they're all staying still against the image of the camera and it starts lighting up and it's not lighting anymore. That's some fascinating stuff. And I know we're going to get to talking about the NASA study coming up as well, but NASA's archive must be filled with that kind of footage as well. And you must think, what have they managed to not have on there that we've not seen?
Yeah. What people have to realize too with these space cameras is that they are recording all kinds of stuff to the NASA downlink, and also on the space station and inside of the STS space shuttles. They have tons of high-powered cameras, like Nikon cameras with amazing zoom lenses, that the astronauts are taking photos and taking video recordings with, and, back in the day, they even had camcorders, big old like shoulder things. So they're heavily outfitted with cameras. Where does all that data go? That comes back to Earth, and it is probably gone through by somebody at NASA. And I don't understand why NASA doesn't have if it's truly just a public civilian research agency, why isn't there an archive for every single second of that space footage that's been recorded from all the shuttle missions and the ISS missions? It's because some of that information needs to be safeguarded. Some of the stuff that's being recorded on it, for sure, might be foreign intelligence craft, spy satellites, and in some cases, UFOs from another origin. And they're worried about that information being public, so they keep it to themselves. It's also interesting if you think about just space in terms of these objects and how they move. So the space station moves at 17,150 miles per hour, okay, which is about 5 miles per second. And if you're thinking of observations or videos being recorded by the space shuttle, I think it moves at around 14,000 to 17,000 miles per hour as well. And you basically have objects that are moving past the shuttle or the space station, doing right angle turns, sometimes even stopping on a dime and moving into formation. That has to be intelligently controlled. That can't be just a prosaic object like ice, space debris, or junk. And yeah, I mean, you were asking before, like, what else do they have? That's what everybody's curious about, and I wonder what this UAP research panel really was after and what they've been doing. The 15 scientists that were hired to look after and do a report on UAP. When you listen to Sean Kirkpatrick, who's the director of Arrow, he seems to say none of this seems to be anomalous enough to be like of ET origin, right? But he does pass the buck off to NASA. And he does, in some reports, say that NASA has more information than we have on these UAP issues and UAP reports. What do they have? And I think on May 31st, 2023, it's going to be really interesting to see what that ends up being and what they end up releasing.
Just before we get to that, you were right, 1976 for the Tehran incident. I could go and edit out my mistake, but I won't, because, mistakes are mistakes. It happens. But yeah, 1976.
I make them all the time, trust me.
Yeah, for the purists out there, let's get the information right. Buzz Aldrin is one of the most famous names on the planet. If you say Buzz Aldrin, people think astronaut, space, He's charismatic and he's a very likable guy. He has made some phenomenally incredible claims on UFOs in his time, usually on live TV. Of all the folks who know what he's talking about, he really should be one of them. Why do you think there are astronauts like Buzz Aldrin who are happy to discuss seeing various objects and crafts? And he's talked about monoliths that are on other planets and moons, yet others seem to toe the company line much better and are quite derisory and laugh at the UFO subject. When I'm not saying everyone who goes into space sees a UFO and sees an alien spacecraft, but there seems to be a massive disparity, doesn't there, between a Buzz Aldrin and, a lot of the more modern astronauts, shall we say?
Well, I think Buzz is from this era where you toe the party line, but because he's considered such a celebrity and hero, he feels also conflicted with the things that he possibly witnessed, which is, he chased a UFO craft when he was a test pilot, far before he went to space, according to testimony that I featured in one of my docs. And he also, was part of the report of a UFO, which the Neil Armstrong reported, asked if the S-4B should be anywhere around them when they were on the way to the moon during Apollo 11. And that's a really well documented case. And I think Buzz Aldrin has changed that story over time. He wants to talk about what he really witnessed, but he's conflicted and knows he can't because he swore an oath. And you just don't talk about those things unless your military, leaders say you can. And he's a military guy, essentially, right? So I think other astronauts have talked about things they said. There's Leroy Chan, who saw 3 flying lights when he was an STS astronaut. And there's obviously Story Musgrave that believes we're being visited and has been very vocal about his theories on extraterrestrial intelligence being out there. But they have to be careful because I think it's still such a woo subject for a lot of the world. They don't want to hurt their credibility and hurt their chances of, having a career or being able to be taken seriously by their peers. So I think that it's becoming more mainstream now. And I would love to see other astronauts come forward and talk about what they know or what they experienced in space in terms of anomalies, UFOs. If any of them listen to your program, please reach out to me. I'm documenting this stuff like crazy and will continue to going forward.
You said in the documentary that the footage we see from the shuttle missions, STS, the ISS, is as compelling as the gimbal, the Tic Tac, and I can't disagree with that. But why do you think it doesn't have the same impact? Why did that footage go viral? Yet the stuff that's been online for years, decades, on your YouTube, on forums, on your VHS compilation tapes from the 90s, which I'm sure you'll be well aware of, that used to sit on most video shelves. Why has that stuff not had the same public impact?
I think it's a matter of public opinion. It had a big impact on me, and it had a big impact on parts of the UFO community when that stuff was released. And I interviewed Martin Stubbs in this documentary, who's a Canadian that was intercepting the NASA downlink with his cable satellite systems at the company he worked at, and recording that downlink footage over, a long duration during years and years onto Betacam tapes. And then he would go through on a traditional editing system, a linear editing system, frame by frame, on his nights and weekends and find UFOs in space. And that was groundbreaking to me. And that's why I included him in the documentary as well, to just show the history of this subject and people researching UFOs in space. And I think that you will always have an interest in space, and it's incredibly important now for us to document this stuff and have it well scrutinized in the public. Now that UFOs are, for lack of a better word, mainstream. Since 2017, it's become more studied and of interest to the mainstream. So part of my job documenting this stuff is to reinvigorate that interest and reintroduce it to the public, the UFO community, as well as, hopefully get some eyes from the masses on this. Because it is equally as interesting as the Nimitz and Tic Tac UFO footage, for the fact that this is being recorded by space cameras, by highly professional space research institutions, a research institution, and the technology is state of the art for the time, and even today, far light, infrared, ultraviolet camera technology is high quality technology, right? You can't
Yeah.
see in that light spectrum. So they're looking into space for something that's hard to see. And UFOs are things that are hard to see. Not everybody gets to see them. Some people see them and it's a life-changing incident, right? Experiencers and personnel from military and space agencies. And so these videos are not like doctored videos that are showing things that are created with computer graphics. They're not CGI in these videos. These are just objects that are being recorded on space cameras in a different light spectrum sometimes. And I think it's important to compare that to these gun cameras that were recording Tic Tacs and gimbals, the gimbal Go Fast gimbal UFO, because that again is gun camera technology on state of the art aircraft that is recording in infrared. In another light spectrum, it's at the other end of the light spectrum that we can't see with our human eye. But the military uses that to see things that are hard to see, which are UFOs.
So let's bring it right up to modern times, right? Almost ahead of ourselves, because as we record this, we're a couple of weeks away from that NASA study wrapping up. When it was announced, it was pretty low budget and seemingly a preliminary study to see if there was a further study to be had. The recent confirmation of that press call for the 31st of May says, and I'll quote, "It is not a review or assessment of previous unidentifiable observations. The report will inform NASA on what possible data could be collected in the future to shed light on the nature and origin of UAP." So I think they're trying to set their stall out early that this was a look at what we should or could look at. What do you expect NASA's study at this point then to show, and what do you hope it potentially launches into?
Well, yeah, I mean, they even say, it's in accordance with the Federal Advisory Committee Act. NASA will be looking at these anomalous phenomenon independent study team, and they will be meeting on Wednesday, May 31st at 10:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And they will have the live broadcast on nasa.go live, and public participation is going to be available. So public people are going to be allowed to upvote questions to see if those could be asked and answered by this research group. The agenda of the meeting and the slides will be presented and available on a web page as well. So I think we will find out more. I think they will say some of the stuff that they've been looking at that's been coming from, UFO reports. And then they're trying to interact with the public on this subject because they know that there is such a interest globally right now in this issue, and I hope that they're able to present details on the fact that some of this stuff is definitely anomalous enough that it can't be considered from a foreign adversary or from possible military programs that are being carried out by the American military and defense agencies. That's what I hope. I'm not quite sure. Like, if they're expecting, it's supposed to be, a private media-based presentation first. Chrissy Newton was saying that she's actually, you're friends with Chrissy, I am too. She's part of the debrief, and they're going to be actually brought into the initial session that's going to be a private media presentation, and then they're going to go live to the public with the rest of it. I don't know. I mean, I think they're just trying to also present the idea that they're interested in UAP. But in my series, I'm trying to present the idea that they've always been interested in UAP off the record.
I think your series shows that they have to have been interested in UAP because these things are presenting themselves, aren't they? Over and over and over again across the decades. Gary Nolan in the last 24 hours has gone viral, whether he wanted to or not. I don't know if you've seen this from
Yeah.
the SALT conference, the SALT conference, and his comments about UAPs. I want to know, do you think, and I'm going to be covering this, and people listening to this will have heard the various shows on it by this point and seen the social media comments. Do you think we're building towards an explosion of information finally coming out from official channels, the government, NASA, hearings, officials, military, or are we going to be still here in 20 years' time, me running a podcast talking about disclosures coming, you're on the Apollo 40 to 49 missions, we're back on the manned missions and we're seeing things. What do you think? Where are we going to be, Darcy?
Yeah, I think, I cover this also in Fastwalkers. Stephen Bassett profiles what developments are happening in Congress in terms of new laws to protect whistleblowers,
Mm.
new laws in these basically trying to unify intelligence and defense organizations on the idea that their personnel can come forward with accounts that they've had or experiences that they've had with UAP, and to protect those people so that they could speak to organizations like Arrow. And apparently, Arrow has had multiple people come forward from military backgrounds that have given their testimony on very credible UAP incidents that have happened in history. And I think if you have laws being passed and that type of whistleblower protection information out there, and a growing interest in the public, and NASA being part of the research of unidentified anomalous phenomenon with their independent study, that points to me that this is going to go mainstream in a big way, and there will be some kind of official disclosure. Can't say for sure it's going to be this year. I'm not as confident as John Ramirez on that topic, but we seem to be going down a road of mainstream disclosure, and whether that's later this year or next year or the year after, I don't know. But I think there could be something, especially if there might be some kind of military aggression happening between our foreign adversaries and North America and their allies.
Well, hopefully not, but yeah, there's a lot of cards on the table right now, potentially to be played in the geopolitical situation, shall we say. Darcy, brilliant speaking with you again so soon. And just to finish up, can I ask you what you're working on next, if you've got anything in the pipeline?
I do have a couple projects in the pipeline, which are, I can't really talk about right now, but I promise if people check out Fastwalkers and they like that, it's going to be more of the same, very well documented, factual information where we show as much, documents and videos and testimony that prove that something historically is going on with something very interesting that has to do with UFOs. So I'm working on two different projects right now, and I'm really excited to present more stuff later this year. But thank you so much for having me on. If people like my work, I really appreciate a star rating or a review left on Amazon Prime and iTunes, like these types of platforms, because it helps others understand what they're actually going to be observing. And I really appreciate you having me on, and your audience is really cool and really well informed people.
I'd like to think so. And you can get it on those platforms. I'll put the link in the description, geni.us/Fastwalkers, and it's on all the usual streaming platforms like you've mentioned there too. That'll be in there. Thank you very much for joining me, Darcy, and speak to you again soon.
Thanks, brother. Have a good one.
That is all for this week's show. Thank you very much for listening. Please remember to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. You can like, retweet and subscribe. That would all be very much appreciated. The shows are being uploaded onto YouTube as we speak more and more. You can sign up at patreon.com/That UFO podcast to access the shows ad-free as well. Please get in touch on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, That UFO podcast. Of course, on Twitter, it's at UFO UAPAM. And again, folks, as always, keep looking up. You never know what you might see.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne and smoked a little around. Meditative game of state full on meta. I can't imagine how it could have been any better. I got to the top of the stairs and there he was. Like, you awake? I was about to abduct you, cuz. I jumped back and nearly kissed myself, and I climbed out the window after the elf, and I woke up in my bed and there was something on my head and everything was weird and everything was red. And I called out to my boys. They thought this was noise. They thought it was a dream. They thought it was my toys. They thought it was my problems, and they think I should seek therapy, and I don't know what to do because it doesn't really scare me. If you really want to know who I think they'd be, I think it's you and me and us and we and him and her and that and she and that thing over there and what's that, Jake? If we're being serious, open your mind, consider your heart, consider time, consider your space, consider your lies, consider your life, consider your eyes. It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer. It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer.
Thank you.